The PowerPoint video for Chapter 3, Consequences of Victimization. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of consequences that someone may suffer as a result of being a victim of crime. So first we're going to talk about physical consequences. So injury can be short-lived to permanent injury depending on how severe the victimization is. So some of the characteristics of those who do incur injury, and this is from the National Crime Victimization Survey 2018, is that 38% of sexual assault victims were physically injured. 35% of robbery victims were physically injured. Incidents perpetrated by non-strangers were more likely to result in injury than those perpetrated by strangers. So females are more likely to be injured during an assault, and this is 26% compared to males at 19%. So for murder and non-negligent manslaughter, these are the statistics for the Uniform Crime Report for 2018. So the vast majority of murder victims are males, so about, over 3/4. About 43% of murder victims were Black. Most murder victims were murdered by an acquaintance. So I know we sort of think of, the boogeyman or this sort of stranger crimes, but those are very unlikely. And most people are murdered by somebody they know, whether that be a romantic partner, a friend, an acquaintance, etc. So guns are the weapon of choice when a weapon is used in a murder. And the motive for the majority of known homicides are simply arguments. We hear a lot about, serial killers and all this stuff, but usually it's just two people get into an argument and, it becomes heated and one ends up killing the other one. So we're going to talk a little bit about psychological consequences as well. So as a result of being a victim of crime, there's 3 common affective responses. So the first is depression. This is common for juveniles experience bullying victimization, but it's also common for people experience a wide variety of victimization, whether that be physical, like an assault, to, being a victim of fraud. So I'm sure we're all, familiar with some of the symptoms of depression, sadness, lethargy, don't want to, engage in things you once enjoyed doing. Maybe you're sleeping too much or not enough, no appetite, too much of an appetite. So this is an effective response for a lot of people that are victims of crime. And along with depression comes anxiety. Oftentimes people will experience depression and anxiety at the same time. And anxiety is often accompanied by physical symptoms as well. So it could be lightheadedness, it could be, a racing heartbeat, it could be, just acting really jumpy. So that's another effective response for crime victims. And some crime victims also experience reductions in self-esteem and self-worth. So being a victim of crime might actually alter the way in which one views oneself. And this is especially prominent in female victims and sexual assault victims as well. So being a victim of sexual assault is likely to lower your self-esteem. Another outcome of being a victim of crime could be post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. So this affects approximately 25% of crime victims versus 8% of the general population. So a much, much higher, risk of developing PTSD if you've been a victim of a crime. So when we think of PTSD, we often think of people that have been involved in a war or witnessing a serious injury or death. And this is the most common source of PTSD for males. But for women, rape and sexual molestation is the most common source of PTSD. So PTSD, you might experience flashbacks to that horrible event. You might have reoccurring nightmares. You might become aggressive and agitated, have problems sleeping, and this is something that really affects your daily life. So, although we talk a little bit about the psychological consequences, we have to note that there's no normal response to trauma. So, some people display a wide variety of emotions. So, people could display, PTSD or depression, anxiety, while some have a very flat affect. And what you mean by flat affect is it seems that, it doesn't affect them at all, but in reality, it really does. So, we can't say that there's a normal response to being a victim of crime, and it affects everybody differently. Another consequence of being a victim of crime is self-blame and learned helplessness. So, self-blame is when someone blames oneself for victimization. So, this happens often with sexual assault. It might happen if you are a victim of fraud as well. So, there's a couple different types. So, categorical self-blame is when you're blaming your character. So, you generally think that victimization is deserved, being like, damn, if I didn't go to that party and drink all that, I wouldn't have been assaulted. So this is something that, maybe you are feeling that it was a result of your character. So maybe, going to that party is a result of, acting a little bit impulsively. And there's also behavioral self-blame, where the victim can do something to avoid a future victimization. So maybe you left your house unlocked and you got burglarized. So this would be maybe blaming yourself for this, but thinking, okay, well, as long as I keep locking my door in the future, I won't be victimized again. So learned helplessness is also a consequence of being a victim of crime. And this is a feeling that responding to a victimization is useless. So this happens a lot in people that have been repeatedly victimized. They just think, you know what, I'm just going to act passive about this because there's nothing that can really be done about this. I'm not going to fight back. I'm just going to, let it happen. So these people may stay in risky situations because they, they're helpless. They just don't feel like anything that they do is going to stop their victimization. Along with physical and psychological consequences, we also have to talk about the economic consequences of crime victimization. So these are incurred by both the victim and the general public as well. So it's very, very, very costly. Crime costs us all a lot of money. The total economic cost estimated to be between 35.8 million at the very, very, very sort of low conservative end of that to $3.2 trillion a year. This is really, really hard to come up with an accurate number because some costs, such as maybe pain and suffering, are really, really hard to put into numbers. They're really hard to quantify. So, we have a very wide range here of the costs of crime depending on how, you're measuring things. So there's some common economic costs. So property losses, the cost of medical care, time away from work, school, and home, and the pain, suffering, and quality of life reduction. So this includes things like, not wanting to do things that you normally enjoy because you're scared of getting victimized, and also legal costs as well. The legal system is very, very costly. Okay, so some property loss due to victimization. About 94% of property crime victims experience economic loss. I'm not too sure where that 6% that didn't experience any loss, but generally when someone steals our property or damages our property, it's going to cost money to replace that item. Arson costs over $15,000 per incident. Motor vehicle theft, about $9,500. About 16% of victims recover some or all of their property. So that's not a high number at all. So, over 4/5 of people that experience property loss do not get their property back. And generally, they're not going to be reimbursed for that. Medical care as well. About 6% of victims of violence had medical costs. That seems a little bit low. Transporting victims to the hospital, doctor care, prescription drugs, and things like therapy, physical therapy afterwards, all very, very expensive. So here are some economic consequences by crime type. So this is how much these crimes cost our country every year. So the economic cost of child abuse, about $6.2 billion annually. Battered women cost about $1.8 billion annually. Assaults with injuries, about $1,400 per incident. And then a drunk driving victim that's injured, it's about $6,400 per incident. So gunshot victims make up about a third of all crime-related hospitalizations. So the most common, I guess, reason that people are hospitalized. Lifetime medical costs are about $2.8 billion for all gunshot victims, and this is for 1 year in 2017. So this is how much those victims will cost over the course of their lifetime treating their gunshot victim, or treating their gunshot. Okay, so financial fraud costs lots of money as well. So there's 3 million victims in 2017 NCVS, and we know that this is even a little bit higher in the most recent NCVS. So almost 1% of the population has been a victim of fraud. It's very expensive. It costs, if you see, over $3 billion in 1 year. Only about 14% of victims reported to the police. Fraud is one of the most unreported crimes, generally because people either don't know that they've been victimized or that they're embarrassed that they were a victim of fraud, they got tricked, and they're not going to report it to the police. Or maybe they were just defrauded of maybe, a couple $100 and they think it's probably not worth it to report. We'll talk about this at length in chapter, I believe chapter 11 or 12. We talk at length about fraud victimization. So 53% of those victims reported economic problems after victimization. So if you have someone scamming you and they're spending all your rent money, you're going to have problems making rent. So per incident, about $1,000 the mean and about $200 the median, on average for a total of over $3 billion. That's just in 1 year. Okay, so mental health care also very, very costly. About 10 to 20% of mental health costs are crime related. So people suffering from PTSD, suffering from anxiety, suffering from depression, very costly as well. Productivity costs as well. So this could be at a place of employment, housework, and school. So maybe you're in charge of taking care of the home and providing childcare. A victim of crime, you're recovering, you're going to have to, get a babysitter for those, however long that takes. Not being able to go to school. Maybe you're going to have to retake courses, not being able to go to work, going to lose out on money there. So about 7% of crime victims take time off work to recover from their victimization. So pain, suffering, and quality of life issues, this is really the most difficult element to quantify. We can't really come up with a dollar amount for this. Victims, they might change their routines, they might change their lifestyle. Maybe they were once very outgoing and, going out every weekend and were victimized and decide to stay home all the time. How can we attribute a dollar to this, the enjoyment someone has and the quality of life that somebody has? Okay, and crime victimization is also very costly to the criminal justice system. So the United States spends upwards of $295 billion annually on the criminal justice system. So very, very, very expensive. United States covers 1/4 of health insurance payouts to crime victims, so through Medicaid, etc. The gunshot victims cost taxpayers about $4.5 billion annually. And insurance companies pay $45 billion on crime-related claims. So often this is property crime. Crime victims are more likely than the general public to be uninsured. So this is not coming from private insurance, but it's coming from the taxpayers. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about vicarious victimization. So this is effects of victimization, not on the victim themselves, but people who are close to the victim. So this is often thought of in homicide victimizations, how, the friends and families feel afterwards. They can have these sort of really bad psychological effects as well, though they were not the one that was directly victimized. So when loved ones of crime victims also suffer the consequences of victimization, homicide survivors, like I just said, people that are dissatisfied with police related to more vicarious victimization. So maybe those people that, were close to the crime victim felt that they were not treated nicely by the police. That's going to make their vicarious victimization just a little bit more likely. So it may occur when someone is not even directly related to the victim or crime, but traumatized by watching coverage of violent acts through media. So this was really prevalent during September 11th. Watching this on TV, we all know, well, those of us who were old enough to remember, it was all over every single channel for a very long time. A lot of people experience vicarious victimization, especially the people that were living in New York. So there's some elements that increase the likelihood of experiencing vicarious victimization. If there's a realistic threat of death to all members, and I mean for the people living in New York, there was a realistic threat of death, extraordinary carnage, strong community affiliation. So in these sort of stronger communities, if something happens to them, more likely to be experience vicarious victimization. This happens a lot in school shootings as well, mass shootings. If the community members witness the event, if there's symbolic significance of the victims to the community, and a need for rescue workers. And finally, significant media attention will increase those feelings of vicarious victimization as well, especially when, we just feel like we can't get away from it. It's on every TV channel, every time we open social media. These factors make it more likely that someone might have those negative psychological effects on a crime that maybe they did not experience. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about reporting victimization. So like I said in chapter 2, crime is very, very underreported. It's important to report it, but it's often not. And about half of crimes are reported. Of course, this varies very, very widely depending on the crime type. Recently, our most recent sort of data says that maybe it's more like 2/3 of crime are not reported, but again, it really, really depends on the crime type. So like I was saying in the last PowerPoint, auto theft is the most reported crime. So most people insure their cars, and if they want, the insurance company to buy them a new car, they're going to have to report it as stolen. Sexual assault, domestic violence, and fraud are much, 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 much less reported. Like I said, fraud victims are often embarrassed or they don't know they've been victimized. Domestic violence victims often rely on the offender for, financials, and maybe they feel like they can't get away and move away from them. And then sexual assault, maybe the person is feeling like it was their fault, or they think that the police won't believe them for reporting. So reports are most likely if the offender is armed, if the offender is under the influence of drugs and alcohol, or the victim believes that they were, if the offender is a stranger, so much, much less likely to report if you know the offender is a non-gang member, and the victim suffers an injury. Reports are less likely when the offender and victim know each other, when the victim is involved in high-risk lifestyle. So if the victim is also an offender and gets victimized, they're probably not going to report their crime. They don't want to, they don't want to come under the, radar of police officers when they're also engaging in this high-risk lifestyle. And reports are less likely when the victim is under influence of drugs and alcohol during the crime. So this often happens with sexual assault or even, aggravated assault. Simple assault is the victim thinks, oh, well, I was drunk. The police are not going to believe me, so I'm just not going to report my crime. Okay, and these are from the NCVS, National Crime Victimization. Common reasons to report the crime. Maybe you want to prevent a future crime from happening to you. You want to punish the offender for doing this to you. Maybe you want to protect others. You want to recover your stolen property, and you want to collect on insurance. So again, it varies widely on why people choose to report their crime. Common reasons that victims do not report is that it's a private matter, and this happens a lot with domestic violence. It's kind of seen as one of those things that, we're not going to get the police involved, just figure it out in our family. Maybe they reported it to another official. Often this could be to the school. If you're a victim of crime in your college or university, you're probably going to go to the college and university before you go to the police. It's important to go to both. Maybe the crime was unsuccessful and the item was returned. Maybe someone, tried to grab your purse and run off, and you're able to hold on and the person took off without it. You might not report then because they didn't really get what they wanted. Maybe you're fearful that the offender is going to return. A lot of people who don't report have a distrust in the criminal justice system. They just simply do not trust the police. And they might feel that it wasn't important enough. So maybe you got scammed out of a couple $100, but think, well, I'm just going to try to protect my information a little bit better. It's really not worth going to the police when they're probably not going to be able to get those couple $100 back. And again, embarrassment. This happens a lot with fraud victims and sexual assault victims as well. They don't want to, either they're embarrassed that they're going to get scammed, or they're embarrassed to tell the police exactly what would happen. I'm sure we've all seen sort of, those videos on what happens during sexual assault trials, and those defense lawyers will come at the victim. So they don't want to go through that. They're just going to not report their crime. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the fear of crime. So fear is an emotional response to a perceived threat, and it's a physiological response causing a fight or flee reaction. So the fear of crime is really different than the perceived risk of crime. So you could be fearful of crime and not think that anything's ever going to happen to you. Or maybe you're thinking, okay, I'm, probably going to get victimized at one point in my life, but you don't really fear crime. So it's two sort of separate concepts. So the fear of crime activates the body to alert them to danger. So if you're fearful of getting victimized, maybe your heart starts racing faster, you become really on edge, you become very alert. And your perceived risk is that, deciding whether or not it's likely that the person will become a crime victim. Fear of crime is really difficult to measure. The types of questions that are asked don't really ask about fear specifically, but more how safe do you feel at your school or neighborhood. So you could feel very safe, but still be fearful of being victimized. Again, it doesn't necessarily cover every crime as well. So when we think of fear of crime, we often think about being the victim of a violent crime, maybe a sexual assault, but there's lots of different types of crime that don't involve violence at all. And you could be fear of, having your identity stolen as well. So some groups are actually less likely to be victimized, but report higher levels of fear. So here we see the difference again between perceived risk and fear of crime. So females and older persons are much more fearful of crime than young males. For females, this is really driven by the fear of sexual assaults, and we call this the shadow hypothesis. So because women are generally, fearful of being sexually assaulted, this in turn increases fear for all types of crime. Older individuals as well. Why? They might feel like they're, less likely that they're going to be able to fend off attackers or otherwise protect themselves. We all know that older individuals are much less likely to be victims of crime. They might, spend most of their nights at home watching the news instead of going out partying. But media exposure also has something to do with it. And if they're sitting at home and watching the news all the time, often, we're watching crimes happen on the news all the time, they might be more fearful of getting victimized. So incivilities are tied to fear of crime. So incivilities are these low-level breaches of community standards that indicate erosion of conventionally accepted norms and values. And these take on two different forms. So physical incivilities. So this is just, living in a place where there's litter, there's trash everywhere, there's untended property, maybe there is houses with broken windows, dilapidated buildings. This can increase the fear of crime because we think, okay, these incivilities are tied to being a high-risk neighborhood, or a neighborhood that, is maybe not patrolled by police as much. These could also be social. So if there's a lot of rowdy youth around, people loitering, people drinking in the streets, this might also, let someone know that, okay, maybe this isn't the best neighborhood. It seems like there might be a lot of crime that goes on here, and makes that area be, people a little bit more fearful when they're in it. Fear of crime can also be seen as good, can be good if it leads to protection. So if you're scared of your house getting burglarized and it leads you to, get a Ring doorbell, get a guard dog, build a fence, get, better motion detecting lights. So this could be good because it might lead someone to better protect themselves. It could also lead to avoidance behaviors, so restrictions that people place on their behaviors. So if we think, okay, this bar, it's fun to hang out with, but, it seems a little shady, there's kind of some scary people there, I'm just going to go to a different bar instead that I'm less likely to, be victimized at. Or you might stay home as well. And then it could lead to defensive behaviors. So people guarding themselves or purchasing a gun.